And welcome. My name is Jamie Fisher. I'm faculty at UC Davis in German and Cinema and Digital Media, and I'm the director of the UC Davis Humanities Institute. And I welcome you to our annual Human Rights Film Festival here on campus. Before we get started with tonight's discussion of the film Belly of the Beast, I want to say a few thank yous. First and foremost, the DHI staff, which made all of this possible, especially in this very challenging year where we moved the festival online, which, as you can imagine, introduced all sorts of software challenges to running things remotely. So above all, thank you to Gina Nunes, Elliot Pollard, and to Kathy Wallerstein for helping with the organization. The Human Rights Film Festival that the Humanities Institute runs and arranges is done with important collaborators on campus, including the UC Davis Human Rights Studies program, as well as Human Rights Watch and its film festival, from which we usually draw the films. I would also like to thank some co-sponsors of our festival, including the Menedeshram Museum on campus, as well as the Kruk Art Museum in Sacramento, the Bita Daryabari Endowment in Persian Language and Literature, and the Hemispheric Institute on the Americas, and finally BAMFA, which stands for the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. So the UC Davis Humanities Institute is a leading voice on our campus for the essential value of the arts and humanities. Part of our mission is to underscore how the humanities and arts can, and we think should, contribute to debates and controversies in the broader society. Films and other media about human rights seem a crucial means for the humanities and arts to contribute to improving our contemporary world. For example, films, of course, allow us to travel places you'll never be able to visit, and maybe of which you're not even aware, even when they are, as with tonight's film, in our own backyard. Such films also help us understand and empathize with people and entire peoples whose stories are often neglected or even deliberately concealed. So tonight we have the discussion of the film Belly of the Beast, which is available on our film festival player, which is available at our website, dhi.ucdavis.edu. Belly of the Beast, as I mentioned, is one of those films that is sort of in our own backyard, but I think in many ways introduces a place and a perspective that few of us have experienced, and I think is wonderfully revelatory about our state of California. I mean, each year we try to play at least one film about California, and to highlight how a lot of these human rights issues that we're paying attention to all over the world also are of concern here close to home. So tonight's film was directed by Erica Cohn. Erica Cohn is a Peabody and Emmy award-winning filmmaker who Variety recognized as one of 2017's top documentary filmmakers. Most recently, Erica directed and produced our film tonight, Belly of the Beast, which was recently named a New York Times Critics' Pick. Erica also directed and produced The Judge, which premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival in 2017, and co-directed and produced In Football We Trust, which premiered at Sundance, the Sundance Film Festival in 2015. Erica tonight will be in conversation with Professor Ofelia Cuevas. Dr. Ofelia Ortiz Cuevas is an interdisciplinary scholar in the Department of Chicano Studies at UC Davis. She received her PhD from the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC San Diego in 2008. Her research is at the intersection of critical race studies, visual and cultural studies, and geography and law. Her work focuses on race, prisons, and policing, and interrogates critical questions like what lives constitute an ethical crisis, and what is the contemporary value embedded in the practice of racial violence. She was a UC President's postdoctoral fellow and has taught extensively in the UC system. She's currently completing her manuscript, Mortifications of the Flesh, Racial Violence in a Time of Crisis, which maps the historical continuities and discontinuities of policing and state violence on the material and discursive terrains of law, visual culture, productions, and race populations. She's also at work on a second book entitled Policing LA's Human Terrain, The Criminal Non-Human at Point Zero, which examines Los Angeles County Jail as a critical point on the city's cartography of productive human terrain. So thank you both for being here, and thank you to our audience. Our format will be that we shall have this conversation between Professor Cuevas and Erica for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, during which you're welcome to post questions, and then we'll have time for questions after that and go until about 6 p.m. Pacific time. You may post questions either in the Q&A function or in the chat on Zoom webinar. So thanks again for being here, and we look forward to this conversation. Ophelia?
Thank you. Jamie, thank you for the introduction. I'm really, happy to be here and be invited to talk about this documentary. I had heard about the documentary just short, maybe within the last couple of months. And so I was, was kind of excited that, when Jamie said, "Hey, can you do an intro for this documentary, Belly of the Beast?" Um, so I finally got to see it, which, I've been thinking about these last 2 days a lot about what I saw and how to kind of, what I could kind of garner from this story that was being told, this story about, Kelly Dillon, and, in some ways a very old story, a very, the story of eugenics and sterilization and racial violence, right? Because those particular types of practices on the bodies are a form of racial violence that are tied to things like, nation state building, colonial settlement, systems, actually even the mission systems in California practiced things like sterilization, um, uh, Native American reservations. There were practices like this, across the United States. So it is a very it's a very old story. It's a very U.S. It's a very old story in U.S. history. I want to say American history, but I'm finding it harder and harder to keep saying American instead of just U.S. So, as I was trying to watch it and not just simply think about the history, I think what made the documentary very compelling is, like, the contemporary specificity, and I presume we might talk about this at some length. The the geohistorical specificity of California. I didn't know, for all the work that I've been doing on prisons, and, again, focusing on usually the CDC, the California prison system. I did not know, and maybe this is a good starting point. I mean, I have two questions. I mean, I think I have one question that's very basic. You probably get asked this all the time, Erica, but one of the secondary questions to me is, and I hope we can talk, how and why California? Like, well, how I thought about it a lot these last 2 days. I feel like I know California, the political economy of California very well. I feel like I know its racial history very well. And I didn't know that California, can actually have that particular type of uh, like nefarious notoriety, right? That's one of the things. California is famous for very, very many things, right? It's kind of it stands alone in so many ways in as a state in the U.S. This was one I didn't know. I did not know that, California has a history of having the most forced sterilizations out of any other state in the country historically. Had no idea. I mean, I've known some, like there, there's the other documentary, No Mas Bebes. I'm sure you know about that, right? Like, that told that story of sterilizations at LA County Jail. But I still had no idea that outside of that, right, that California holds that kind of record, right? Along with having the largest county jail on the planet. So maybe with those two things, we can kind of start talking about, like, what might those relationships be. I do want to, I hope it's okay to start off with something. Again, you probably get asked this all the time, but maybe it'll be a good start. How and why this topic? Like, what kind of compelled you to do this story about Kelly Dillon?
Yeah, I actually was first introduced to attorney Cynthia Chandler 10 years ago through a mutual friend, and was really inspired by Cynthia's compassionate release work. She was the first attorney in California to get someone out of prison under compassionate release, and was also really inspired by Justice Now, the organization that she co-founded, which was one of the only organizations, if not the only organizations in the country, that had board members who are currently incarcerated, informing strategy, informing policy, informing approach for those in the free world or the non-incarcerated populations. And they had a particular campaign called the Let Our Families Have a Future campaign, which essentially exposed the multiple ways that prisons destroy the basic fundamental human right to family. One of the most heinous, of course, being the illegal sterilizations, primarily targeting women of color, which really screamed eugenics to me. As a Jewish woman who grew up in Salt Lake City, the phrase "never again" was always profoundly in the back of my mind. And when I learned about this different kind of genocide that was happening through imprisonment, that was happening through forced sterilization behind bars, I knew that I wanted to get involved. And initially that was as a volunteer. Cynthia invited me into the organization where I became a volunteer legal advocate, providing direct service needs for over 150 people inside California's women's prisons. And from there, in collaboration with people inside, began working on a project that ultimately would become Belly of the Beast. And in the initial kind of inception of this film, the idea was to chronicle the incredible human rights documentation work that was happening inside prison, and the activists who really funneled this information out that the prison didn't want to be exposed through this network of underground activists to allied organizations in the free world. And that process changed when I met Kelly. And I had heard of Kelly through my work at Justice Now. She was very well known for her activism. She was incredibly influential in the entire human rights documentation process inside prisons, and was the first person to discover that the illegal sterilizations were happening inside California's women's prisons. And as she describes in the film, you know, the light bulb went off when she saw that other women of color, predominantly Black women, were coming out with these surgeries during their reproductive capacity years. And that kind of was the catalyst to begin Justice Now's investigation. And at the time, Kelly was really moving beyond the sterilization abuse. She had lost her trial. She was focusing on her career. She was doing domestic violence prevention and gang intervention work in Los Angeles, and first kind of became involved in the film as an advisor behind the camera. And that all changed again when the Center for Investigative Reporting released their series of articles. And there was this tremendous momentum, this tremendous energy, a national conversation that led to a series of hearings in California, as you see in the film, and potential legislation. And that was the moment that Kelly really got called back into the movement, called to testify on behalf of so many other people that wouldn't have the opportunity to testify. And that was really the moment that both of us decided that we would start filming her experiences and testifying leading up to testifying. And the more and more we filmed, it became clear that the film really needed to center around her experiences and her relationship with Cynthia Chandler.
Can I ask you, I'm just a little curious, are you still in touch with Kelly Dillon? And, you know, like presently, where I'm just wondering kind of where things are at right now.
Yeah, Kelly is a dear friend. You know, we became friends before she became a film participant in front of the camera. She's very involved in the outreach and engagement campaign. We have strategy meetings probably every other day about how we're reaching our audiences. She's been doing a lot of Q&As and panels with me. She's also working for the Los Angeles Mayor's Office. She is the founder of Back to the Basics and the executive director of Back to the Basics, a community empowerment organization in Los Angeles, and is the head of the Southeast Congress Council in Los Angeles. So doing amazing, incredible things, and also working on the reparations campaign with Cynthia and 3 organizations: the California Latinas for Reproductive Justice, California Coalition for Women Prisoners, and the Disability Rights and Education Defense Fund.
Yeah. It is really, it is truly like an incredible, you know, important story. And so, you know, as I was watching it again, it became very, I was, you know, surprised, and I'm not sure why I was surprised. Again, to find out that California is this site where, again, you know, the most forced sterilizations in the country historically happen in a state like California, right? And sometimes things like that can be surprising, because oftentimes I think folks think, and I don't usually, you know, that California is this place where it's very liberal. It's very, you know, there's this kind of a very liberal, it's mostly a blue state, you know. I think, and I do know, as somebody who studies, you know, the California prison system in particular, and the histories of racial violence in California, that's really, you know, that's really quite, like it's extremely untrue, right? I mean, California is also a site where, you know, a number of kind of marked or at least notable like practices of racial violence, some that are not even that old, some of them that come across only in like policy and politics, you know, like 3 strikes, right? The propositions that happened in the mid 1980s, which is the moment in which probably, you know, mid 1980s, we're headed towards the peak of California prison building that at that point, right? A lot of us not knowing and understanding. At that point, I was an undergrad at Berkeley, and my own family was kind of involved in this kind of mass incarceration, right? Like this in the 1990s, California was building a prison and a half a year, the CDC, so state prison. For anybody out there, I just want to make it very clear, there's a difference between state prison and jails. Just had to have this conversation last night. You know, California is building a prison and a half a year, every year of the 1990s. And so there's this kind of, again, that's the moment of this exponential growth. And that I do really think is kind of ground zero for the rest of the kind of what people still call the prison industrial complex, prison building that happened across the United States. The intensity at which California went at that prison building, again, I mean, obviously we are still living in, although I think people are trying to make some kind of, or attempts to deal with what happened for 30 years in California, how it drastically changed the geography in multiple levels. When I say geography, I mean that in a very complex way, like the human geography, the political geography, the physical geography of the state. I mean, it absolutely changed what California is and for sure what it could have been, right? If one of the biggest state building projects in the history of the world, which has been the US prison building project, has been called that, right? That there is no other state project as big as the buildings of prisons in the United States. And if California is ground zero for that, I'm wondering how you think how is it that these practices that again slip through? I think one of the points in the documentary that I found so kind of critical and important, and it's something I feel like I grapple with a lot in my own work, is how does something like this happen? You have this one, it's kind of in the middle of the documentary where Cynthia going through these files and these documents to kind of figure out, right, like what had ended up happening. And there's these questions get posed. How does this happen with this kind of documentation, with this regulation, with the bureaucracies that go on in a place like jails, right? You know, paperwork after paperwork after paperwork. This has to be signed. This has to be signed. Somebody steps in and out of a certain room. I know how it works, right? This, you know, everybody's checked in, checked out, everything's accounted for. And there's always these questions. How does something like this still happen? Because at that point when this is happening, it is actually illegal, right? It's an illegal practice. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, and then maybe we can kind of move to the California stuff and then start taking some questions. Because it really was, and the reason, you know, it's a question, again, I ask a lot in my own work, and I think a lot of us ask in that way, that the same way in which we keep seeing police violence happen right in front of our eyes, we see police murders, and we keep scratching our heads going, how's this happen? This is in the realm of law. Like, how's this happening? Why is this? I kind of feel like those two things are the same. Yeah. And yet what you had when you go through this paperwork and you're talking about these bureaucracies and these ways of tracking folks, watching what's happening, that this still happens, you know?
Yeah, I really believe that the reason that these abuses keep happening is because the institutions and the state actors who have committed these harms are not held accountable. And so while there have been apologies, while we acknowledge that California had the most heinous, the most notorious sterilization program, eugenics program, having sterilized over 1/3 of all of people sterilized in the United States, 20,000 people were sterilized between 1909 and 1979. And while that has been acknowledged, the governor in 2003 of California apologized for the eugenics past. It was still going on in California's women's prisons. And because there hasn't been accountability for what has happened in the past and what continues to happen, I believe we will see more of these abuses. And actually, we have a petition for reparations right now for California's forced sterilization survivors, both historically and contemporary survivors, on our website, bellythebeastfilm.com. And I believe that that will not only make amends for the historical sterilizations following in the footsteps of 2 states, actually, that passed reparations for sterilization survivors, North Carolina and Virginia, but also to ensure accountability for modern day instances of forced sterilization, like what happened a few years ago in California's women's prisons, and what we just saw in the ICE detention facility in Georgia. And as you mentioned, California is really looked at as a trendsetter in terms of policy, in terms of culture, in terms of law. And so I believe if California does pass this reparations movement, it will create a ripple effect throughout the rest of the nation.
Well, let's get to, it's already 5:34. Let me get to some questions. And I do have one more thing I want to ask you, but I will open this up to the audience here. There's one question here from an anonymous attendee. It says, what was your thought process when you were putting together Kelly's story? How did you put the scenes together in order to create that particular impact?
I think one of the key elements to Kelly's story that we actually found very late in the game was the deposition footage, which you see. We had actually finished the film end of 2018. We were ready to submit to film festivals. We were ready. We thought we were close to picture lock. And I was in the process of fact checking the details surrounding Kelly's case. And the law firm that took on her case, Bingham and McCutcheon, had merged with another law firm, and no attorneys who had represented Kelly's case were a part of that merge. So I had found this random attorney who was still a part of this, who really cared deeply about this film and was committed to helping me find these files from Kelly's case for fact-checking purposes. And we finally found them in this random storage unit in the middle of nowhere in California. And in the middle of those files was the DVD deposition of Kelly's sterilization trial. And that deposition was so incredible. We completely restructured the film around it. And as you see, the deposition serves as our introduction to imprisonment, later placing us in the midst of an unfolding trial. And finally, as a storytelling device, kind of invoking both past and present as Kelly pursues her dreams while also confronting the sense of obligation to the cause and her sense of obligation to seeking justice, not only for herself, but for others. And so Kelly was very involved in the storytelling process from the very beginning, first as an advisor and then as a character in the film. And so everything was kind of done in tandem. And I will say, this could have been an entire series on Kelly's life. The work that she's doing now is so incredible. She's getting a lot of acknowledgement for the work that she's doing now. So I will say that it was a constant kind of understanding that it was not only Kelly's story, but had to have deep emotional resonance with invoking both the historical survivors and the people that she was representing by testifying on behalf of people who couldn't testify.
I'm gonna take a couple more questions about how you made the documentary, because I know there's folks here that want to know how the film was made, and there's a number of questions like that about the actual production of the film. One of them, I think, or there's a couple of them up there like this, but I think I'm just going to ask it simply. What was it like, and how was it getting access to being in and out of the state facility? What did you have to deal with, and what did you have to go through, and how did that kind of maybe shape the documentary itself?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of production, prisons are so far out of all of our consciousness, out of our sight, far from our physical reach. They're placed in locations that are inaccessible via public transportation. One of the main prisons that we chose to focus on, CCWF, is in Chowchilla, and that is the world's largest women's prison, and 3.5 hours from the Bay Area, 4.5, 5 hours from Los Angeles. So we didn't have access to some of the moments that were so important in this film. We didn't have access to interior cells. We didn't have access to doctors' offices or surgical rooms. And because we were really conjuring the notion of informed consent, what that would mean, does informed consent even exist in coercive environments? It was important for me to viscerally place viewers in these intimate, vulnerable spaces, like what it would be like to be on an exam room table in a prison, totally vulnerable with your legs dangling off the edge of the table, or being handcuffed to a gurney and being wheeled into a surgical operating room. And so because we didn't have access to those spaces, we chose to recreate those environments, and actually shot our recreations in Utah through the Utah Tax Incentive Program in a dilapidated jail that we recreated to look like the spaces that were so carefully described to me in great detail, in a working jail in Salt Lake, and also a medical simulation center. And I really think this project was so important, was made in collaboration with people who were in prison, that it was important for all of us to really demystify incarceration and really reimagine how we view imprisonment. And so our process was really to push the boundaries of verite filmmaking and use a combination of first-person POV and recreation and observational footage to create that environment.
Yeah. Oh, now that makes sense. It's very smooth. I mean, it was really smooth in the movie. Now that you say that, I'm like going, oh, because there were moments I was like, how did that happen? How did she get that? Because and I did love the perspective of the camera in that way. I mean, to show the level of vulnerability and exposure, and the power dynamics and the power relations involved in, let's say even the OBGYN and the person's body on the table, right? Like that you could capture that was so it was really remarkable, right? I mean, it was this kind of way that just, I think, said a lot about, in general, the relationship of the body, of a human body and a human being and an individual once they are imprisoned, right? That they are kind of, it does become, absolutely, almost, and this could be up for a bunch of different levels of kind of like discussion, almost completely without power, right? Like it completely without power or rights, or even as those things slip between the actual laws that exist. This was illegal. I mean, this was not supposed to be, right? This was an illegal, already a practice that was illegal, and yet it was still happening. And I think that, in some ways, I mean, for me, it was kind of, again, those moments of those questions, like, how does this happen in this place that has this kind of exact, what I call, like in some of my work, when I do LA County Jail, when I write about LA County Jail, I talk about like this system of where it's like, it has this exacting kind of bureaucracies and procedures. Like, let's say you're trying to go see family, you got a list of things you got to do. You can't wear this, you can't do that. You can't wear your hair like this. You can't have your shoes like this. You have to show up like that. I mean, the detail in which things are kept track of and accounted for. And yet these horrors can happen in a place that is supposed to embody this idea of law and order. Right. And yet in those own institutions, in some ways it's a little, well, in these places where law and order is supposed to happen, is like these horrific, almost indescribable violences.
For sure. And I think what's so interesting in the case of California, as you mentioned before, I mean, the federal government is complicit in this as well, because the federal receiver was brought in to oversee California's healthcare in prisons because conditions were so deplorable. And of course, in determining who should be held accountable, CDC is blaming the federal receiver. The federal receiver is blaming CDC. Federal receiver says we had no idea what we were actually paying for. And in the film, you hear, Cynthia really and Corey Johnson break this down for us. There are layers upon layers upon layers of approval for someone to leave prison walls. These procedures were not happening within prisons itself. They were happening at outside contracted hospitals. And so in order for someone to be transported, in order for someone to be to have security at that outside hospital, in order for someone to be transported back, and all the liabilities associated with that, this is not just one individual state actor that we're talking about. This is not just one bad apple. This is the entire system that is complicit.
I mean, I think that, okay, then that's exactly what I was trying to kind of pull out, right? This, even when it comes to policing violence and police violence, right? It isn't about one bad apple. It isn't about, trying to teach some folks to have more either cultural awareness or to understand better, like this is a way you should police somebody and not police. You don't police this way, you police this way. Right. And maybe the same thing can be said for, you're not supposed to doctor this way, you're supposed to do, right? That those kinds of things in particular cannot and have not historically been able to deal with these particular types of violences. And I think this is a perfect example because again, in what was it, 1979, when it becomes outlawed, and yet it's still happening. And there is an earlier history, and the way to understand it, that it's so kind of in almost multiple layers of the system, right? That it's all over it. It isn't, again, it's not a couple bad actors. It isn't a couple people who just seem to misunderstand something. It isn't just one rogue doctor that is, has some kind of evil streak, right? It is legitimated by so many other spaces. In my work on LA County Jail, I was writing the title that Jamie kind of talked about. I had a friend that was in county jail, and he was picked up, and he was awaiting trial and had been in there for a couple weeks already. I got a phone call one night, and he's like, "Oh my God, you got to get me out of here. You got to get me out of here. I'm going to die in here." And what had happened is, in between transport, he was put into a 2-man cell, and he was left there for like 3 or 4, almost 4 days straight. And they just kept putting more men in there, black and brown men. And I was supposed to write about like black and brown conflict in prisons. Well, what I tried to argue is at that point, because what was happening there in this place that had this exacting rationalities, right? These bureaucracies and the administrative, because it's always in the practice of administration where you can start pulling things apart, going, oh, see what you can find in between these things. I call it kind of like the violent arithmetic of the state, where everybody knows there's not supposed to be more than 2 men in there, and yet they stuffed 18 guys in this cell that could have killed each other and died, and left them standing. They had to stand for 3 nights straight. How does something like that happen, right? And a place like LA County Jail, also has this, as well as like LA County Hospital, and those two spaces are completely interrelated, has had those particular types of crises and violence happen, even before the prison industrial complex was built in the 1980s in California. The LA County Jail has been under litigation for, detrimental conditions and that could cause bodily harm and death since 1972, right? So it had been a long-standing kind of known practice, like known conditions. Right. Like it's known. This isn't unknown to anyone. And so, like, I'm wondering, I know we only got a little bit of time left, like, and I'll take another question from the audience. Like, how is it, or maybe you can take some time to think about this and I could look at another question. How do we go about dealing with this, like, again, I understand holding some individuals accountable, but like we said, it is larger. It is related to so many other structures, or it's also related to this understanding that somehow law is supposed to help us get out of this when sometimes it doesn't.
Right.
Or, just again, individual practices of teaching people how not to be racist is supposed to work. And that's not going to work. I mean, we already know that, right? You can't teach violence out of policing at a workshops and stuff, right? It is in the structure and history and system of policing.
Yeah, I think that it's important to look at imprisonment as a form of genocide when you look at who is being locked up, how, with increasingly long sentences throughout their reproductive capacity years. I mean, prisons themselves destroy the basic fundamental human right to family. And when you look at imprisonment through that lens, when you look at other institutions through that lens, I mean, we're seeing right in front of our face how eugenics is alive and well in this moment. We are witnessing systemic racism and population control through policing, through imprisonment, through our immigration detention system, through lack of access to healthcare during the pandemic. And so for me, it's not just a state actor level. This is definitely holding institutions accountable and in some cases abolishing these institutions.
I'm sorry, can you just say that last part?
Yeah, and abolishing these institutions. I think, for me, when you look at the way the immigration detention system works, when you look at the way our prison system works, it's not possible to root out systemic racism with systems that are currently in place.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. There's has come up a couple times. And I thought about this myself too, as somebody who works closely, like, at a bunch of different kind of organizing levels throughout like the last 2.5 decades, my work. They're board members at Justice Now are actually incarcerated individuals, right? How did that happen, and how did you see that as effective? I mean, I was like, wow, that's amazing. That is such a great practice to actually have folks inside as part of trying to make change outside.
Well, I can't speak on behalf of Cynthia and kind of her process in co-founding Justice Now, but I can speak to the importance of, in doing this work, in addressing gendered violence, in addressing systemic racism through our criminal justice system. It is absolutely imperative that we center that work around people who are directly impacted, and that we take our directives from people who are directly impacted, as opposed to organizations in the free world who come in and impose these ideas, these potential solutions, without actually listening to the people who have direct lived experience and who have the solutions, potential solutions themselves. I think I have been so struck by the resilience and the brilliance and the activism that happens inside prison. And I believe our conversations, and that's why this film was created in collaboration with people inside and was made for people who are currently incarcerated, and to be used as a tool for that activism.
That's great. That's great. There's one question too. I want to try to get to as many of these as possible. Has the film been screened in CCW? Has it been screened inside the facility that you?
So the film was actually going to be broadcast on PBS this Monday, November 23rd. So please share the word, spread the word, share the news about this. If you have loved ones who are in prison or in jail, please let them know. This is an opportunity for them to see the film. As many people know, PBS is one of the only consistent stations that people who are in prison have consistent access to.
Oh, that's good. Okay. There's a question here that probably I would think a lot of documentary filmmakers might want to know, is how, oh, I lost it. Was it difficult to finance the film?
It
I mean,
was so incredibly difficult to finance this film. We could have a whole conversation about just the funding model for this film. I think in the early days, people, specifically funders, couldn't either believe that this was happening
yeah.
and wanted more proof, even though we had dozens of testimonials from people who had experienced the sterilization abuse, or really wanted concrete numbers to better understand if this was something that they should care about. Is this just one person this happened to? How many people did this happen to? It was as if they were quantifying numbers to the degree of responsibility and degree of interest. So it wasn't really after the Intel Center for Investigative Reporting released their articles and their very controversial findings that we were able to kind of build momentum during this national conversation to get some seed funding from Fund for Investigative Journalism and diversity development funding from ITVS, the independent kind of branch of PBS, as well as Tribeca, who really championed this film and helped shepherd it through. It was definitely a difficult film to fund.
It's just funny that you said that, because I get asked that a lot when I've been trying to work on a certain project, and folks go like, "Are you sure there's this really many Californians that have been affected by this? Are you sure there's really 12? Do you know how many? And they want numbers or proof because they can't believe even something California built, 27 facilities inside of 30 years and one UC, right? Like things like that. And they're like, "Are you sure that's real? Is it?" I'm like, "Yes, it's absolutely real, right?" And I'm constantly being asked to kind of show proof because they almost are in disbelief with some just basic things that some of us know really well, right, from our work. I do have a question here about where the sterilizations were performed. That says, "I heard that some were done at UC Davis Medical Center. Did they really use teaching hospital to do these? That would seem to underscore the normalizations of these outrageous procedures in the medical community." So what could you tell us about that?
Yeah, these happened at outside contracted hospitals. They happened in 2 teaching hospitals, UC Davis, UCSD. And when you look at the history of eugenics in medicine, when you look at the history of medical racism, it's very clear that our healthcare institutions are very much a part of this entire plan.
Yeah, I had no. So actually, I'll just ask, the doctor that was in the doctor that you had in the, what was his name?
Dr. Heinrich?
Yeah, where was he? Maybe I missed where he was. Where was he located? I'm just curious.
He was at VSPW, the Valley State Prison for Women.
Oh, so he was inside the facility.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's see. Here's a good question. Did the California Medical Association ever address this bill now, which is now law? Like, it would seem they would have a lot to answer for. Do you know what they've said about it, what they know about it?
After the bill was passed, this was so quickly swept under the rug. It was we passed the bill, we moved on. There was no justice for the survivors. There was no notification process for people who were sterilized and still to this day don't know. There was no memorial. There was no apology. And so that's really key, a part of the reparations movement, the reparations bill and budget request that is being considered right now in California. Again, you can go to bellyofthebeastfilm.com to sign the petition to support that, which is essential in ensuring that these practices, these heinous abuses, don't continue to happen. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done.
Yeah. I think we have, can we squeeze in one more question? I think we might be able to squeeze in one more. Do you think, and maybe this will still kind of get back to the California thing. I know, I thought the geography of the film and just your scenes in kind of the opening, I thought was stunning. I thought the stunning shots, or the opening shots were stunning. Since the film has an interesting geography, including scenes from very different parts of California, what does this geography in the film say about these issues?
It's such an interesting question. I mean, I really, in talking about how I wanted to visualize imprisonment, I wanted to use imagery that evoked memory and passage of time, that really contrasted confinement and freedom. And so you see that in how kind of at the opening of the film, we start in these very wide areas, you know, and slowly, slowly, slowly our world shrinks in. You know, the last shot before the title is the interior cell. So you're going through this process, like Kelly, like everyone else in the film has gone through, a process of entering confinement. In terms of how other locations were shot, it was always keeping that in mind. You know, the intimacy, the warmth of one's home when Kelly comes back to her family. You know, the way that we chose a color palette of life in prison was very cold, was very stark, had a totally different tint, kind of a bluish tint to it. So those images were really important. And in terms of how we portrayed California almost as a character itself in this, was to invoke the legacy of sterilization, the legacy of eugenics in California. So it was always choosing imagery that was California specific, that could be used both past, present, future.
Yeah, it was really beautiful. I mean, it really was pretty visually stunning. I can't wait to show my class in the winter. I'm gonna show my class in the winter.
You'll have to let me know what they say. How they
maybe I can come and talk. Maybe I'll have you come talk. They would love it. It would be fantastic. Okay, so one last question. I'm gonna squeeze in one last one. What are you working on right now?
Such a good question. I can't fully talk about all the things, but I do have this beautiful short film that I, you know, during COVID, it's difficult to make films right now. And one of my colleagues and I partnered with this family who, after 15 years of struggling with homelessness, secured housing at the beginning of the pandemic. And it's a love letter to their family, to their children, about the notion of home, how it's not a place, how it's inside you, it's within your family. And they shot all of it. And I'm just so grateful to be a part of this really beautiful little offering in this time when so much is out of our control.
True. That's great. Well, I look forward to it, and I look forward to more conversations between the two of us. Like I said, I'm really excited about this documentary. I'm constantly looking for more really solid documentaries for my classes. So I am. It's the hour. It's 6 o'clock. So I just want to say, if I can, on behalf of the Humanities Institute of UC Davis, thank you, Erica, for coming, and I want to thank Jamie and Gina for inviting me and having me here. And introducing me and the rest of the Davis community to your work.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for this amazing conversation.
Okay. All right. I guess bye, Erica and Gina and everyone else. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.